Hey everybody, and welcome back to the BookTube channel. My name is David Walters, again, of fanfiaddict.com, and today I am with author Sam J. Miller. Sam, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. The sun just came out. It's been snowing for approximately 11 years in New York City, so I'm doing good. I have natural
Good.
light.
Yeah, we actually had our first, I guess you could call it a snow day. Was it been about a week ago now? I'm in Alabama, so we had, I don't know, a quarter of an inch, maybe. It lasted for all of about 2 hours, and then like the next day, it was like 70 degrees. So
Right. Well, context is everything with snow. New York City gets 6 feet of snow, and we're like, yeah, whatever, we can handle it. But Texas, for example, if folks
oh
aren't,
gosh, I know.
if the infrastructure is not there and folks aren't ready for it, it can really mess you up. So,
Oh yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, we called it a snowpocalypse. What's it been, about 5 or 6 years now? Where basically, I don't know, it was like an inch or two of snow and just a ton of ice, just basically shut down most of Alabama for like 3 days.
Wow.
And like I was stuck downtown. And I mean I think it took like 3 or 4 hours to go a block in my car. So
Wow.
it was bad. Yeah, but yeah, it's all in context. It's all, who's actually prepared for it. We think we have like one salt truck in the whole state. So
Yeah.
well, I kind of wanted to start off just having you, tell us about yourself, tell us about growing up, and kind of how you got into writing.
Yeah, I grew up in upstate New York, and for folks who don't know, I mean, New York City is like this beautiful, progressive, cultural, wonderful place. But people tend to think New York State is just like that, and it is not. And upstate New York is pretty, parts of it are pretty, rural and economically depressed and politically conservative. Like there were a lot of Confederate flags around me when I was growing up, even though I'm in New
Huh.
York State. And so, I grew up in a place that was pretty, hard hit by sort of economic situation and, where it wasn't super progressive. And for a young gay Jewish kid, there were not a lot of people like me. And I sort of actually like started writing almost as like a writing for me started by telling lies so people would like me. So, for example, the elementary school I went to was like this farm school where not hardly any of the kids even had televisions, let alone were going to the movies. So I would tell people, like in second and third grade, that I had seen all these horror movies that I hadn't really seen, but they hadn't seen them either. So I could tell them the plot of these movies, and it had nothing to do with the reality of the movie, of course. But they didn't know that, and I could like, I would tell them this whole story, and then I would be like, and then I'll tell you, come back tomorrow at recess, and I will tell you what happens next. So yeah, for me that's how it started, was telling lies so people would like me. And then I guess in the process of that discovered that telling ridiculous stories is really fun and I enjoy it and might be kind of good at it. So that was the beginning of my writer journey. I was also really fortunate because my mom is a great writer and was publishing stories in really prestigious literary journals since before I was born. And so when I was 11, 12, she showed me how to like write a self-addressed stamped envelope and write a cover letter and find magazines to submit to. So I have been submitting to the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction since I was 12, and
Wow.
at age 40, I just sold my first story to them 2 years ago. I'm now 42. So yeah, been doing it for a while.
I gotcha. Yeah, you were just talking about, kids going to see movies, and I was just thinking the other day, I was talking to my wife, and I go, it's really weird that there's a possibility that our daughter never goes to a movie theater.
Wow,
How crazy is that? Like,
that's
because
super
we were
crazy.
just talking about, how HBO is doing this whole, like, all these things are coming on demand on HBO Max this year from Warner Brothers, and I was like, all these movie theaters are just, really struggling, and now they're trying to raise minimum wage and all that stuff. And I go, she may never know what it's like to go to a movie theater. How weird is that?
Yeah,
It's
that's
nuts.
super scary. Although I did, the timeline ideally is going to match up because they're talking in New York State about opening theaters up again at 25% capacity 5 days before Godzilla versus Kong comes out. And I
Mm.
really don't want to watch that on my television. I really want to see that on the big screen. So I'm very hopeful that the numbers stay down. Of course, because I want the pandemic to subside, but also
Right.
because I really want to
But also because we want to see King Kong on the big screen.
exactly.
Nothing wrong with that at all. So, just I read a little bit about you. I feel like I know you now. I've read a lot about you on your website and kind of following you on social media and stuff. So you grew up. Your father and I guess your grandfather were both butchers, and that was kind of, I guess, what your role was going to be at one time. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I come from a long line of butchers, and I when I turned 12, my dad was like, "All right, you don't have Saturdays anymore. You're going to come to work with me." And he put me to work from a really young age, cutting meat, being a butcher. So it was definitely in my blood. I think that there's definitely a timeline where that was my life. But my
Mm-hmm.
father, to his credit, was really like he worked really hard. Owning a small business is really difficult, and it was a real struggle for him, and it was incredibly stressful and difficult, and ultimately unsustainable. And when Walmart came to town in the '90s, it put us out of business, like a lot of small businesses in my hometown. But my father really didn't want that for me. He was really determined that I would like go to college and be able to find a job that didn't require me to be standing up and carrying heavy things and worrying about paying his employees and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that even if that hadn't happened, even if Walmart hadn't come along, my father wanted me to not be doing that for a living, and I wanted very badly to get the hell out of Hudson, New York. So I probably would not have stayed in Hudson to be a butcher, even if the store hadn't gone out of business.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, had I wanted to, that would have been the sort of natural storyline, I think.
Yeah, the natural progression of things.
Yeah.
I gotcha. So tell me, you've been writing clearly for a while. Who influenced you, I guess, growing up as far as reading, and maybe if there was somebody you wanted to potentially emulate, I guess. I know that's I don't know if that's a good word to use for authors nowadays because you don't want to emulate anybody, you want to be original. But who, I guess, early on would you say?
Yeah, I definitely wanted to emulate. I read a lot of Ray Bradbury. I think Ray Bradbury was the first writer who made me really fall in love with language and the idea that you can, like, the way you write sentences shapes the story that you tell, and that you can have horror and poetry, you can have wonder and lyricism, and also just like really tight, really good story writing. So that was definitely an early thing. Stephen King, I know I'm not the only one who was like a young baby horror fan who was like obsessed with Stephen King, and in certain ways still is. So
Hmm.
Stephen King was really important. I think that those are sort of like the writers of my childhood, and the writers of my adulthood. I think writers like Octavia Butler, who is amazing and sort of like was like a really transformative experience discovering her work. My husband turned me on to her, and it was just really amazing because she, like, I've always been, when Walmart came to town and put us out of business, it turned me into a little communist when I was 15. I was like very acutely aware of the injustices of global capitalism from a young age, and as a Jew in an anti-Semitic world, as a gay man in a homophobic world, always been sort of acutely aware of systemic injustice and really wanting to do something about it, and have always been in activism on one level or another. So I really wanted to, like, I spent 15 years as a community organizer in New York City, working on issues of homelessness, housing, and policing. And Octavia Butler was the first one who showed me that you can be an activist with your writing. It's not just like, do your writing and do your activism. It's like that can be one thing.
Hmm.
So that was really game changing for me. And Ted Chiang remains my favorite short story writer. And his work was also really like transformative and like helped me achieve a paradigm shift in how I thought about writing.
I gotcha. Yeah, and nobody ever stays a Stephen King fan or anything. Those don't exist anymore.
Yeah, you know, what one reviewer said of my new novel, The Blade Between, that it was like James Baldwin meets Stephen King, which I had never thought of that. But those are like my two, in many ways, my sort of like greatest role models of writing, of like being able to write about the gnarly horror monster shit and the gnarly social justice, you know, power dynamics of America. So the idea that someone would see that in something of mine was pretty mind blowing. So yeah, Stephen King definitely remains right up there. I had to reread Needful Things while I was writing The Blade Between, because there's a spoiler alert. There's a lot of sort of like similarities in the story, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't accidentally doing something that I read in Needful Things when I was 15 years old and had sort of digested and forgot that wasn't mine. And then
Right.
like, why don't you do this? And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. Except maybe someone already did that. So
Yeah.
yeah, I Stephen King is in me in more ways than I can probably count.
I gotcha. Yeah, I feel like Stephen King's usually like in the top 5 for just about any author, at least in the past couple of years when I've been doing these chats. I feel like his name has always come up, whether it's science fiction, fantasy, you know, romance even. I mean, it's just everybody's like, well, when I grew up, I read Stephen King. You know, it's just kind of, I guess it's just kind of what you do. So now, as far as writing goes, tell me a little bit about your writing process. How has it evolved over the years from, you know, writing to magazines to actually writing your first, you know, debut?
I think that the big change. I mean, so first of all, I've always written both novels and short stories. I wrote my first novel when I was 17 on a Salvation Army typewriter, single spaced, like really tightly, like it was a bad scene all around. But you know, before you even started reading, it was shitty, and once you did, it was worse. So I've always written novels, but nobody wanted them. Like when my first novel, when my debut novel, The Art of Starving, came out in 2017, that was actually my 7th novel. I had written 6 novels before that no one wanted, and I sent them. You know, I know the drill, right? I sent them to every agent, every editor, every independent publishing house, trying desperately to get a home for them. And you know, every time you fail to sell a novel, it's really depressing and really miserable and painful. And the only cure is to like do another one, which sounds like addict behavior of like, oh man, that was rough, I better do that again.
Right.
So yeah, like I had always been writing short stories and novels and trying to get better. For me, the real game changer was going to the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop in 2012, which was a really amazing experience. It's such a great workshop for if you can make the time in your life to take 6 weeks and, you know, spend the not insignificant sum of $5,000. It was really a game changer for me, and so that really got me thinking about story in a whole new way. And I think that you know, as writers, we have to sort of hold 2 contradictory thoughts in our head, 2 contradictory beliefs. One is I'm good, like my stuff is good, someone should read it. You know, if I send it, like trees should be cut down so that books can be printed so that people can read my work, right? That's a certain kind of crazy hubris. But also the other thing is like, you're not that great. Like you have a lot of improving to do. You still have a lot to learn. You are not a perfect writer. So Clarion was where I realized that like, I'm good and I have a long way to go. And being able to embrace both those things made my short stories get a lot better, and that sort of helped me sell short stories in a way that laid the groundwork for selling a novel, because it's very hard to sell a novel. You know, for a first-time novelist, it's not unheard of. It happens all the time, but it's, you know, numerically rare. It's much more common, you know, for writers to sort of cut their teeth and build an audience and build a platform, for want of a better word, by publishing in places, getting short stories out there, you know, figuring out who you are and what you do and who your audience is, and how to connect with them.
Yeah, and I feel like that's definitely changed over the past, we'll say, 10 years. You've got self publishing now. You've got like things like Wattpad, or people can subscribe to your Patreon and stuff like that, where you can have your stuff out there, and then as like you were saying, you build that audience. Eventually, you're going to be seen by publicists and sometimes by agents as well. It's still rare, but it happens. So as far as your writing process, do you outline everything? Do you just sit down and write and as words come to you, or has that changed? Since book one to what book you on now?
Well,
10?
my fourth one just came out, and my fifth one is sort of like in the percolation phase.
Oh, I meant period, not
No,
just
I don't
published
even know.
words.
I don't even know. Probably 11 or 12.
Okay.
There's sort of like these two schools of thought of like, are you an outliner or are you a pantser? Do you play it like by the seat of your pants and just sort of figure it out? And I'm sort of like a hybrid. I'm a half pantser. I have like one leg in my pants and I'm like hopping around because I'll start to write an outline. I'll have every intention of writing an outline. I'll think, yes, if I outline this, I'll figure it all out and know what I'm doing. But then I'll get halfway through and I'll be like, but I don't know what this character would do in this situation. I don't, know the relationships yet. I haven't figured out some of the key sort of like, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And if I'm just plugging in like, then this person betrays this person, and then this person falls in love with this one, then that might not make sense for that character. So usually once I've started to figure out the outline, I'll just start writing. And I'll write some exploratory chapters, and I'll think, well, let me just write a chapter not to be part of the book, just sort of figuring out who this person is. And as I write, the characters come to life, and then they start making the decisions for me of like, no, I would never betray that character. I would definitely not fall in love with that character. So yeah, I outline, but I personally find that my works best when my characters are real enough to me that they start, they attain some kind of sentience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that, bit about kind of writing it almost on the side. You're like, okay, here's this character arc, and let's see how they fit in, and kind of going back and your ability to edit, I guess, kind of their entire story on a separate sheet of paper or a separate document. Do you use Scrivener when you write?
I do use Scrivener. I found it really helpful. Most of certainly my adult novels, Blackfish City and The Blade Between, are pretty complicated in terms of point of view characters and timelines. My young adult novels, less so, but still an issue. So Scrivener's been super helpful to me for like moving stuff around and realizing like taking this discrete chunk and moving it here. So yeah, I love it. I find it super helpful. Microsoft Word is, the best worst option for short stories, I think. And certainly with novels, like one thing is like, a lot of times when you get your edit from your editor, they usually use Microsoft Word. So you have to have it. You have to sort of like be able to process a large number of comments and track changes, things like that. So, the tech tools are, we use the best that are available, and they're not always great, but, they are what they are. Just like fucking like changing the typewriter ribbon was a pain, and changing the paper every time it's always been frustrating. So it's
Right.
great that, relatively speaking, having come from like writing on a typewriter to the age of Scrivener, I'm much happier now. The technological problems are much more minimal. Even like 15 years ago when everyone was using Microsoft Word was not as good, and so things like autosave wasn't so good, and so yeah, there were definitely days where things were worse. So anytime I start talking shit about my technology, I remember that like it was worse. It could easily be worse.
Oh yeah, that's why I'm always baffled when I talk to writers and they say they handwrite everything. I go, how in the world do you go back and like check your stuff? But like that sounds like it would take forever.
I did try that. I did figure like, let me at least make this attempt. And I at the time, had a long subway ride commute every day. So I said, let me like write on the subway since I'm limited in what I can't bring my laptop on the subway and write. So what I found was that my writing got really slow. Like the pacing was really slow. Like because like the pace of my like I can type much faster, and so like the things can move much faster. But when I write by hand, it's much slower, which for some writers is probably good. There's definitely writers who have a slower pace to their work, and that could be beneficial, but not for me. That was a egregious mistake.
I gotcha. So let's kind of get into your books a little bit. So we'll talk about the four that you've got published now. So, and first of all, you've had quite a few award wins, some nominations, several mentions, on top of having translations in several languages. So first off, congratulations on
Thank you.
all of your success with that.
Thank you.
But I want to lead off by asking about your young adult debut, The Art of Starving, which won the Nebula in 2017. Can you tell me about the novel and where you drew your inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, I think of that as sort of like my breakthrough, not just because it was the first one that was published, but it was the novel where I realized what I had to do as a novelist. I think that a lot. I started out like a lot of writers, thinking like, there are certain stories that the public doesn't want, that publishing doesn't want, and that I should try to write, the Hunger Games or whatever the big thing is, whatever's being published. Like I love the Hunger Games, so I wasn't being like my desire to write the Hunger Games was because I love the Hunger Games, and genuinely appreciated what it was doing. But I also thought like, my stories about being like a bullied gay boy with an eating disorder are not the kind of things that publishing wants, and I don't see any books like that on the shelf. So let me, that I can't tell that story. I can't write that novel. And so part of why I wrote all those novels no one wanted was because I was trying really hard not to tell my own story or the story that was most important to me. And it wasn't until I said, you know what, like, fuck that. I want to write the book that only I can write. I want to go to the place that I've been avoiding going. That I really like my writing came alive in a way that publishers could get excited about. Is the only way I can put it. So, I definitely had this experience as a teenager of having an eating disorder, and feeling like that, like it wasn't. There was a lot of body image issues tied up in it, but it wasn't so much about body issue as it was about power and feeling in control and feeling like in a world where everything around me was like violence and ugliness, and no one was valuing me for me. That only by becoming violent and becoming and exerting power could I feel powerful. And so applying the sort of like funhouse mirror magic of speculative fiction to say like, let's take this and turn it like up all the way. I was like, well, what if my eating disorder gave me superpowers? Like, what if starving myself awakened supernatural abilities? And how would I use those to take revenge on everyone who had wronged me? So, a little bit of wish fulfillment, a little bit of bloody revenge, some sex, all the things that I, had been scared of writing. That's what went on the page, and that's what ultimately sold. Like I also I've always loved young adult and really wanted to write young adult, but I had this sort of idea in my head that even though like I had read a lot of young adult and I knew that young adult was like full of sex and profanity and violence and drug use. I also had in my head that it had to be really clean and really, you had to pretty it up. And I was, two of my teachers at Clarion were Cassandra Clare and Holly Black, both of whom are amazing young adult writers. And they were really like, no, go there. Like whatever you can, like whatever horrific thing you can think of, there's a young adult book that does that. There's probably several. So if you go there, it doesn't mean it's a deal breaker. And so like when my amazing editor at Harper Teen made an offer on the book and I was having an initial phone call, I was like, So tell me, like, how comfortable are you with the amount of F-bombs and gay sex in this young adult novel? And she said, I think it has the perfect amount of F-bombs and gay sex. And that's when I knew I had found a good home for it.
I gotcha. Yeah, it is interesting because you're right. When you think of young adult, you think of like what that the age group. You're like, what would they be interested in? And it's kind of like mind blowing that it's exactly what you wrote. It's kind of like that's kind of what life is like, I guess. But I guess when you really boil it down, you're like, okay, well, Hunger Games is young adult and Divergent and all that stuff. So those are fairly clean. They've got some violence in them, but they're not like too over the top. But I do find it interesting how, you spent all that time trying to write something like that and not writing really what you wanted to. And then when you do, everything just like hits.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is yes, my issues as a gay boy are unique to me. Well, they're not unique to me, but they're not universal. I think everyone has that, like those experiences that they think are too ugly or too complicated, that the world doesn't want. And I think that going there is really important, especially for folks like who are, people of color, immigrants, women. Like there's a lot, like, especially if you're not a straight cis white male, then you probably had experiences that are really rough and that are rooted in the injustices of the world, and that white supremacy or patriarchy says, no, we don't want to hear about that. So I think that it's an extra hurdle that writers from marginalized communities have to deal with, of like, we've been told for so long that our stories don't matter or aren't welcome or are only applicable to us and don't have universal appeal the way that like a straight love story supposedly has universal appeal. So I think that's a thing that a lot of folks have to sort of, internalized stuff that we have to sort of confront and grow from.
Yeah. And I feel like now that those types of stories are being told and being published and so forth, that it's just had this like boom in publishing because, I feel like I just can't keep up anymore. There's just so much stuff coming out and it's just like hitting from left and right. And I was just talking to another author, Nick Martell, today. And he goes, I noticed on the blog that you've added some reviewers. I'm like, I can't keep up. I've got to keep adding people. I'm like, I think I'm up to 13 now. I'm like, I just get requests. And I just can't please everybody, and I'm a people pleaser. So, it's one of those things. But yeah, it's so refreshing though, because we're not reading the same stories over and over again. We're getting, like you said, we're getting the stories from people who have basically been silenced for X amount of years, and now that we're getting it, we're realizing how much great fiction is out there that we're just not able to see. Yeah. And it's about time. Yeah. It's taken way too long. But all right, so I want to talk about your next one now. So this will be your adult debut. So let's talk about your John W. Campbell Award-winning novel Blackfish City. So it's a future with rising seas causing dramatic geopolitical changes, and it sounds phenomenal. So tell us a little bit about what it's about, and then we'll go on to the next one.
Yeah, it's about a floating city in the Arctic after climate change has sort of ravaged the globe, and there have been horrific wars fought over access to dwindling resources, and there's mass migration from nations like the United States that have been hit really hard, and that folks are sort of fleeing northward as the sort of cities of the South burn, and into this floating city arrives a woman with a killer whale and a polar bear on a mission, and she sort of sets in motion a chain of horrific mayhem and delightful, touching family scenes. Horrific mayhem and touching family scenes.
You got me on Animal Companions.
Yeah.
You can't beat Animal Companions.
No, there's always an animal companion somewhere in my work.
Awesome. So next we have Destroyable Monsters, which is another YA novel of yours that's it's called half gritty contemporary and half epic fantasy. So what is it about, and why did 17 call it one of the best YA books of 2019?
Destroyable Monsters is sort of told from two perspectives, right? One is this sort of like realistic story of a teenager named Ash who's a photographer, and her best friend is this guy named Solomon, who's sort of like has a incipient mental illness that's pretty significant and is probably schizophrenia but hasn't been diagnosed. And so she's really worried about him, and she's trying to get to the bottom of a trauma that they both experienced when they were 12, that might have that he hasn't processed accurate, that he hasn't been able to process, and that is like making him worse. And so that she thinks that the way to help him is to figure out what happened. But it's also the story of a boy named Solomon who lives in a fantasy world full of dinosaurs and monsters, who is trying to help his best friend, whose name is Ash, who is this refugee princess who's being in a city where half the people are magic users and half the people are not. And there's great tension and animosity between those two. She's being stalked by an uprising movement of people who are against magic. And so it's sort of like these two stories. One is like the gritty realism of Ash trying to save Solomon, and one is the epic fantasy of Solomon trying to save Ash, and the sort of worlds sort of coming together as they sort of go on their sort of separate quests. So, I don't know why 17 liked it. I'm happy they did. It was ambitious. I don't know if, I think I tried really hard, and think in some ways I was successful in sort of like doing this juggling act that hopefully people responded to. So, I'd like to think that is why.
So, okay, animal companions and not dinosaurs. Come on.
Yeah, the dinosaur is an animal companion. Solomon does have an Allosaurus that is his animal companion. So
killing me, Sam.
This is the killer whale companion for
Fantastic.
City, and this is the Allosaurus companion that I got for Destroyable Monsters. And I have a sperm whale for Art of Starving, and a mammoth for The Blade Between, because there's a mammoth in The Blade Between.
That's awesome. Well, speaking of The Blade Between, so it is your newest release. It was released back in December from Echo. What can you tell us about that novel?
It's a horror novel. It's a supernatural thriller. It's about a gay guy with a lot of similarities to me, who's a small town. He comes from a small town named Hudson, where his father had a butcher shop at 310 Warren Street, just like mine did. That he had to flee because of, small town BS when he was young. And that, he returns there to take care of his father, but there's something really eerie and supernatural happening, and as the town has changed over time, and as a lot of like wealthy New Yorkers have been buying second homes, and artistic types have been moving up there and opening up coffee shops, there's been a lot of gentrification and displacement, and a lot of his friends are really struggling to stay, and so he sort of gets involved in a local movement against the displacement to try to stop the developers who are trying to change his town. And my actual hometown of Hudson, is undergoing that dynamic. It has been transformed by a lot of wealthier folks moving in and buying up property and fixing it up and opening up antique stores and coffee houses. And so this is me attempting to sort of think about an anti-gentrification organizing movement plus whales. Because Hudson, in real life, Hudson was a whaling town in the 19th century. That was sort of the engine of its rise to prominence. It was once a very powerful city and economically prosperous, and lost by one vote when the New York State was deciding what its capital would be. So at one point it was a big deal. It's not anymore. But whales were sort of the engine of its rise to power. And so what if those whales, the whales that were sort of slaughtered for its benefit, were still there in some sort of like supernatural fashion? It's sort of like, there's like the old trope in horror of like the town with a secret, like Children of the Corn, or The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, or The Wicker Man, where there's something going on, whether it's supernatural or just creepy pagan, human sacrifice shit. Well, what would happen if gentrification came to that town? Like The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. Like if there's this place where evil monsters or spirits or whatever are dominant, how would that change if rich people started moving in? And how would the supernatural element fight back? So that's what the Blade Between is.
Okay. And I'm going to say this, that last little bit you said, what happens when rich people move in. Stephen Graham Jones is kind of tackling that in the book I'm reading now with My Heart is a Chainsaw. I'm about 25% into it, and that's already kind of a big thing that's kind of going in there. Granted, his is going for more like a big slasher kind of epic, but I think that's really neat. So
Well, that's a comparison I'm deeply honored by, because he's one of my favorite writers writing today. Mongrels is my favorite werewolf novel ever, and I really love The Only Good Indians. So yeah, I haven't read that one yet, but I'm excited to. And yeah, I think this is an issue that's sort of like bubbling up in the community. Like N.K. Jemisin's novel, The City We Became, talks a lot about that, and I think we're starting to see this being a topic that people are figuring out how to write about. It's been sort of like, oh, it's too complex, it's too, whatever. It's fundamental to how capitalism works. So what are you going to do? So I think that we're starting to see a shift that's starting to sort of broaden the conversation around how fiction can engage with real world oppression or violence. So yeah, I'm excited. I didn't know that about My Heart is a Chainsaw. So now I'm even more excited to read it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really good so far. I told him yesterday I hope to have a review tomorrow. I don't know if it's gonna happen. It might be Thursday. So, but so I'm noticing a pattern of photographer protagonists. So what's the story behind that?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, what is up with that? So part of it is just that I do love to take pictures, and my father had a dark room and he showed me how to use it, and it's always been really important to me. But when you're in your 20s, as I once was, you realize you can't do everything. And so I was a painter, and I was in a punk rock band, and I was a photographer, and I was a writer. And then you go out and you get a full-time job, and you have to pay your rent, and you're like, I am lucky to be able to do one of these things in any given week. So I kind of had to let go of a lot of my aspirations. But photography has always been really important to me, and I still do it a lot. And I love that, thanks to social media, I can share my photographs with the world. The other reason, though, is because I personally find writer protagonists really boring. Like, every writer writes about writers,
Right.
and it's a very easy recipe for people to not be able to relate. Like, either you're a writer yourself and you're tired of hearing about writers, or you're not a writer and you don't understand how writing is, and so it doesn't necessarily, you don't really get it, or it's not the most exciting life. So photography is like the more fun, exciting, interesting way to be a storyteller, that I hope people will connect with more than oh, here's another writer with a writer protagonist. No shade.
Your next book's gonna have a writer protagonist, isn't it?
Yeah. No. No shade on writer protagonists. Plenty of writers do that well. I have nothing but respect for you if you can do that well. I can't. So yeah, at least a photographer gets to tell models what to do and go places they're not supposed physically go places. It's just a little more. It's a little more fun than the person like me who's just standing at home being like, "What if this happened?"
Right. Yeah, I gotcha. So, it's probably a difficult question to answer because it feels like it's been forever since we've actually been able to go outside and do things. But what are some of your favorite things to do outside of writing? I mean, obviously photography being one of them. Do you have any other things that you really enjoy doing that when given the opportunity, you get to do?
I love biking. I love riding my bike. It's my main mode of transportation in New York City, which means that I, risk death several times a day because it's quite insane. The life of the relationship between bicyclists and taxi drivers in New York City is like a never-ending war. But I do love biking, and I, now that I can do my day job from my home, and I'm not going out and about anymore, it's less easy to find reasons to go on bike rides. So I miss that. I miss going to movie theaters. I miss going to brunch. Brunch is a very important activity. We don't have a car in New York City, so it's you're kind of at the mercy. You can't go tons of places, but New York City has enough fun stuff that, you don't move to New York City because you want to stay in your apartment all the time, right? Most people who are in New York are like, I want to go out dancing. I want to go to restaurants. I want to go see my friends who all live here. So yeah, I'm excited to just like be out and about, but also I really love being home all the time. And I am enough of a like introvert / extrovert that I enjoy, getting home at a reasonable hour and not riding the subway after midnight and all that stuff. So, as much as I'm like going crazy being inside so much, I got nothing to complain about. I'm like, oh, I have a job and a roof over my head and a person who I live with who I do not want to murder all the time. This is if you're going to go through a pandemic, this is the way to do it, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I was telling my wife. I was like, I'm really realizing how much of an introvert I am just since the beginning of the pandemic. But since the beginning, I mean, we translate 3 months, we had a child. So then I'm like, I kind of want to get back out because it's just us two here all day most of the time because she's a teacher and she went back full time back in September. And literally today has been the first day since I guess August that we've both been home during the day because she took her personal day. So I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I really enjoy working in my office and stuff, but sometimes I'm like, I kind of want to go in the office. How weird does that sound? I used to hate going to the office.
Yep. 100%. Like it'd be nice to go like maybe 2 days a week, maybe not 5 days a week, but like I miss having a place to go and
I miss my commute. I used to listen to a lot of audiobooks on my commute.
Yeah.
So
I used to get exercise on my commute, so I miss exercise.
So last question I got for you. What are some books maybe you've read recently that you'd recommend, or maybe a book or two that you think needs a little more attention?
Well, the number one book that I am most excited about for 2021 is a book called Summer Suns by Lee Mandello, which is a horror novel coming out from Tor that is just really beautiful, brilliant, like queer story with just like it hooks you. It's one of those books that just hooks you from page one of like this character's like plight, their want line, the thing they want, the situation that they're in, of like their best friend who mysteriously died and they have to go home to figure it out. It's just like it hooks you immediately if you're like on board, and I'm going to follow them through some crazy shit. So Lee Mandello's Summer Suns is really amazing. I have been reading all over the place. I've been reading a lot of graphic novels because I'm thinking about writing a graphic novel. And so Tilly Walden's Are You Listening is incredible and highly recommended. Anything by Kaya Shante Wilson is amazing. And his novella Sorcerer of the Wild Deeps really rocked my world. And there's a new book, I think it was just published, called On Fragile Waves by E. Lily Yu, who's one of my favorite short fiction writers. And she just had her first novel come out and it's phenomenal. It's called On Fragile Waves. So those are my top recommendations.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time today to come and chat. It was very nice meeting you. Very nice talking and hearing about your books. I definitely know that I've got to get them added up on the TBR a little bit quicker than Sitter because, again, animal convenience, you can't beat them. So,
thank you for having me. It's nice to chat. I should ask you before you go, what is your top book recommendation that I should be looking forward to?
I mean, do you read a lot of epic fantasy?
It's not my fave. I do read some. I used to think that I hated epic fantasy, but then I read Ursula Le Guin, and I'm just like, no, I just hate a lot of epic fantasy. So you can give me a recommendation.
I'll give you a recommendation, and I guess to the audience. So I finished The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. It's Viking fantasy. It comes out from Orbit in May. It blew my world. But if you want one more closely geared towards you, are you familiar with the horror writer Tim Meyer?
That sounds familiar, but I can't.
Okay, so he lives in New Jersey. He does a lot of small press stuff, Grindhouse. He's got a new book coming out from Silver Shamrock called Malignant Summer. It's his magnum opus. I forgot how many pages it was. I read it last summer, but it comes out this summer. But I called it the New Generation's It.
Oh,
So
wow.
definitely look for that one.
Well,
If you
you
want
had me at
something
it.
super long, yeah. If you want something that's a little bit longer, but is really horror driven, and it's got a little bit of a YA feel to it too. So, but it's phenomenal. So that would be my recommendation for you.
Awesome, David. Thank you so much for chatting and for the
Absolutely,
recommendations.
definitely. Well, you enjoy the rest of your week, and maybe we can do this again sometime.
Anytime.
Perfect. Thanks, Sam.
See ya.